Hello class. Today we are going to be learning about the kidney. Now, the kidney is essential for removing metabolic waste that's produced when you do things like break down proteins, for example. It does so by filtering the blood. Now, they work continuously, processing all of the blood in the body every 30 minutes, and every 24 hours, they filter approximately 200 liters of fluid. Now, your kidneys are the masters at reabsorbing most of that fluid, right? When we filter the blood, it kind of does so indiscriminately. A bunch of stuff leaves the blood, enters your kidney, and your kidney needs to sort out and reabsorb the things our body needs, like water, for example, and it needs to get rid of the metabolic waste products. So, if your kidneys weren't functional, you'd be losing 200 liters of water every day in your urine. You'd obviously die very quickly. Now, your kidneys, as a result, reabsorb, what is that, 99%? So, they reabsorb pretty much all of it, and you excrete just a very small amount that your kidneys actually filter. Now, you have two kidneys. They are bean-shaped. Kidney beans, they kind of look like those. You have two ureters, which connect from your kidneys and go to your bladder. They transport urine to your bladder. You have one bladder, a very simple organ, actually the first organ successfully grown in a laboratory and transplanted into a person. And one urethra, extends from the bladder to the exterior of the body, and thus allows you to excrete that urine, pass it from your body. Now, let's talk about the kidney. Now, it's bean-shaped, about 10 centimeters long, has a very dark colored core, which is densely packed with blood vessels. Right? If we're going to filter our blood, we need to pass a lot of blood through the kidney. As well, if we're going to reabsorb and put most of that stuff back in our blood, we need a lot of blood vessels surrounding every single part of our kidney. Now, these vessels form a network of capillaries and small tubes known as the medulla, which is the inner part of the kidney. And the medulla is divided up into a number of triangular shaped pyramids. You can see here. And each of these pyramids contains tons of the functional unit of the kidney, which is the nephron. Now, each pyramid consists of arterioles, which branch into smaller and smaller arterioles, and the tiniest of which delivers blood to the nephron. Likewise, many tiny venules will take blood away from the nephron and join together, making larger and larger venules until it makes up the renal vein, which carries that filtered blood away from your kidneys. Now, the pyramids contain many collecting tubules, which will transport that urine eventually into the bladder. So this is the nephron, the basic unit, the basic functional unit of your kidney. Now, blood will flow into this little area here, the glomerulus, where blood will leak out. It enters then the proximal convoluted tubule, then goes down the loop of Henle to the distal convoluted tubule, then the collecting duct. And through this, there's a series of passive transport, active transport happening, as well as developing these very strong concentration gradients as you get deeper and deeper into the kidney. And all of this is to properly reabsorb water, among other things, from that filtering. So there's three basic processes that are going to occur. First, filtration, right? We got to get that stuff from our blood and into our kidneys. So the passage of protein-free substances through the capillaries of the glomerulus into the Bowman's capsule. It's going to filter out most small things, but larger molecules or cells do not pass through and enter the filtrate. Next, in that filtrate, we want to reabsorb things. So we're going to reabsorb water and other essential things like certain ions, glucose, maybe free amino acids, things like that. And last up is tubular secretion. We need to add things to our filtrate that we want to get rid of. So let's explore those three processes through the different components of the nephron and show how at each stage those things happen. So, first up, we are going to be exploring the renal capsule and show how the filtration occurs. Then we're going to explore the proximal convoluted tubule where the majority of reabsorption occurs. The loop of Henle, which is there to set up the massive concentration gradient within the kidney. The distal convoluted tubule, where you get tubular secretion, the adding of things to that fluid which your body wants to get rid of. And lastly, the collecting duct, where we finalize the concentration of that urine. So, what happens in the glomerulus, in the Bowman's capsule? So, the entire structure, by the way, is the Bowman's capsule. The glomerulus is this little ball here of blood vessels, and this ball of blood vessels will leak fluids into these Bowman's capsule. Now, how does that happen? Well, this knot of capillaries called the glomerulus, it's fed blood, and we're going to call that the afferent arteriole. And that blood vessel, the afferent arteriole, is actually bigger than the one leaving the glomerulus, the efferent arteriole. And as a result, when you take a pipe that's big and you change the diameter further down, make it smaller, if the flow remains the same, you're going to have higher pressure in that smaller hose. Right? I'm sure all of you with a hose before, have you ever stuck your finger in the end of your hose and allowed you to squirt water way further because you were increasing the pressure? Now, that is effectively what's happening here in our glomerulus. Now, the glomerulus vessels are quite leaky. So under this high blood pressure, a lot of fluid leaks out. And again, it's indiscriminate, but there are a couple things that do not squeeze through. So, what does not squeeze through is going to be blood cells, large proteins, effectively very large molecules, proteins, blood cells. Things like that are not going to pass into the filtrate. Those blood vessels are leaky, but they're not that leaky. They're not that leaky. So, substances such as salts, sugars, water, wastes, and some other smaller molecules will pass easily through the pores of the glomerulus and will enter the Bowman's capsule. So we have a lot of stuff entering the Bowman's capsule, but most of that we're probably going to want to reabsorb. Right? We need to maintain fluid balance and salt balance in our blood, so we're probably going to reabsorb a lot of water, a lot of salts. We don't want to lose out on small molecules like amino acids or sugar, so we're probably going to reabsorb all of those as well. So how do we reabsorb those things? So after it leaks out into the Bowman's capsule, it's going to pass into the proximal convoluted tubule. Right? Because it's proximal to the Bowman's capsule. It's in proximity to. Now, this is the longest and widest part of the nephron. It is lined with epithelial cells containing microvilli and numerous mitochondria. And the reason for that is because we want to absorb as much of those useful materials as possible. So we will actively transport them, which requires energy, up their concentration gradients. So again, this is active transport for a lot of these substances. Now, in this part of the nephron, over 80% of the filtrate is reabsorbed into the tissues and then into the blood. This ensures that all the useful materials that were filtered out, like glucose and amino acids, can re-enter the bloodstream. Now, all glucose, very rare cases like, maybe you're type 2, so maybe you're diabetic, right, type 2, type 1, you have too much blood sugar where you're going to excrete some of that sugar in your urine. So very rare cases you don't absorb all glucose. Some medical conditions you won't absorb all amino acids, but under normal conditions, yes, all sugar, all amino acids will be reabsorbed here. Most mineral ions are also reabsorbed. And this is done by active transport. And if we are removing these ions, the sugars, the solutes from the filtrate, what does that make our filtrate? Well, that makes our filtrate more dilute. So do you think we have to transport water by active transport? No, we don't, right? So most of the water that's reabsorbed in the tubule, the proximal convoluted tubule, does happen by passive transport because we are decreasing the concentration of solutes in that filtrate, and thus our tissue is going to be a higher concentration and water will passively transport out of your filtrate. So most of the water here is reabsorbed by osmosis, which is passive transport as a result. So again, we're actively pumping out those ions, glucose, amino acids, minerals, and as a result, this leaves our filtrate with lower solute concentration, lower osmolarity, and therefore water, because it's lower concentration inside, higher outside, will diffuse by passive transport into the surrounding tissues. So that is reabsorption in a nutshell. So now let's look at the loop of Henle. Now this loop of Henle is very specialized to set up a pretty big concentration gradient in the lower parts of your kidney. So the job of the loop is to make the tissue in the medulla very hypertonic, very high salt, compared to the filtrate in the nephron. And the purpose of this salt bath is to reabsorb water. This is kind of how we're going to make our urine more concentrated as it goes down the collecting duct. Now it does this by pumping sodium and chlorides out of the filtrate into the surrounding tissues. And the first part of the loop of Henle, the descending loop of Henle, is impermeable to ions, but some water leaves by osmosis. So as the filtrate goes down into the descending loop of Henle, the concentration here of solute in your tissue, the surrounding tissue, increases by a lot. So I have here a picture of the relative osmolarity, and you can see that as we dip down, via passive transport, water is diffusing out of our filtrate and becoming more and more concentrated. Right? It's going to reach balance with the external tissue concentration, which means our medulla down here, this inner medulla, is extremely concentrated in salt. So here, all of this water is leaving by passive transport. Now, as we then go up the loop of Henle, the ascending loop of Henle, the walls of your loop of Henle now become impermeable to water, but we actively pump out those sodium and chloride ions. So the descending loop of Henle is impermeable to ions, but we allow water to passively diffuse out, making that very concentrated, that filtrate, when it reaches the bottom of the loop of Henle. Then as it goes up, we make it impermeable to water and actively pump out all of those ions. So as we go up, it's impermeable to water and we actively pump out ions. And by actively pumping out ions, at first it can happen by passive transport a little bit, but as our filtrate gets less concentrated, we have to actively pump it out. And that's to maintain the salt bath that is our medulla. Alright, so now let's talk about the distal convoluted tubule. So it is here where the tubular secretion happens. As that filtrate comes up the ascending loop of Henle, enters that distal convoluted tubule, this is where our body will decide, okay, are we going to secrete certain things into the filtrate in order to get rid of them and balance our body out. So for example, let's say that the pH of your blood is low, right? You have acidosis. Your kidneys can help alleviate that by adding hydrogen ions at this point to the filtrate. So if your blood pH is acidic, you might have hydrogen ions being pumped into that filtrate, so thus raising your blood pH. In the opposite, let's say you're hyperventilating, right? Your blood's becoming alkaline. The opposite will happen, whereas your kidneys, well, we're not going to reabsorb hydrogen. We just won't secrete nearly as much hydrogen into that filtrate. Things like potassium here for salt homeostasis. Let's say your blood's osmolarity is low. Let's say, right, you need more salt in your blood. Well, here then, we're not going to secrete potassium. But let's say your blood pressure is high, right? You have lots of salt in your blood. Well, we're going to secrete potassium into the filtrate to help lower the solute concentration of your blood. And lastly, here, some toxins and other foreign substances are secreted into that filtrate to get it out of your body. So here is where a lot of that addition of things like hydrogen ions, potassium ions, other toxins is occurring in the distal convoluted tubule, right? Distal to your Bowman's capsule. And then last but not least is the collecting duct. So the collecting duct is where the final concentration of your urine happens. Because if we look right here, you can see that it's quite dilute in the distal convoluted tubule. Right? It is quite dilute here. And we can make it much more concentrated as it passes down the collecting duct and into the medulla. But it doesn't always happen. What do you notice happens to your urine if you're just chugging water? What color is it? Well, it's pretty clear, right? Why is it clear? It's clear because you are not reabsorbing as much water in order to maintain fluid balance in the body, right? You have too much fluid, you need to get rid of it, so your urine becomes quite dilute, you pee more often. Flip side, let's say you're in the desert and you are trapped, you're hiking through the desert, there's no water anywhere. What is your body going to do? It's going to radically try to conserve water. You're going to reabsorb as much water as possible from that urine, and as a result, your urine will be very concentrated when you do urinate, right? It'll be a very dark yellow. So your level of hydration can be estimated by the color of your urine. There are a couple things that play with that, however, which we're going to talk about in a second. So as the collecting duct passes through the hypertonic salt bath that we set up via the loop of Henle, water leaves the filtrate by osmosis. So this is, again, passive transport. Now the water leaves through special water channels called aquaporins. And the amount of these aquaporins that are in the walls of your collecting duct are completely regulated by one hormone called antidiuretic hormone, or ADH. Now, ADH is a very important hormone for regulating fluid balance within your body. What would happen if you drank a bunch of alcohol? Well, people tend to urinate a lot when they drink a lot of alcohol. Why is that? Why is that? It's because alcohol will block the secretion of ADH. You're not producing as much ADH, thus less aquaporins on the sides of your collecting ducts, and you don't reabsorb as much water from your filtrate, and thus your urinary output increases and it's more dilute. Now that is why people who drink alcohol, the next morning you wake up with a wild hangover because you are severely dehydrated. By drinking alcohol, you increased urinary output, lowered the fluid balance in your body, and thus left yourself severely dehydrated. So, alcohol has an impact on ADH. That hormone is essential for regulating fluid balance. So, brief recap. Blood enters the afferent arteriole, which is large, into the glomerulus, and the efferent arteriole is a little smaller, right? So it increases pressure in the glomerulus. Filtrate leaks out. This filtrate is indiscriminate, has lots of things in it, but it doesn't contain larger molecules or large proteins, cells, things like that. Now, most of your reabsorption happens in the proximal convoluted tubule by active transport, except for water, because we're transporting out ions, so the water can leave via osmosis. 80% is reabsorbed here of everything that our body needs. Glucose, amino acids, ions, things like that. The loop of Henle generates that salt bath that's needed for the collecting duct to concentrate your urine. Right? We lose water by passive transport going down the loop of Henle. The loop of Henle here is impermeable to ions, and then on the way up it's impermeable to water, and we pump out those ions from the filtrate, leaving it very dilute when it gets to the distal convoluted tubule, where our body will then, via tubular secretion, secrete into it things our body wants to get rid of, right? It's going to regulate here body pH, salt balance within the body, and it's going to get rid of toxins and some other things we want to get rid of. And then lastly, the collecting duct, as it passes through the salty inner medulla, will cause water to passively transport via osmosis into the surrounding tissues and then be reabsorbed into your blood vessels and thus your blood. So, the collecting duct is essential for regulating fluid balance in the body. If we're ingesting far too much fluid, we don't secrete as much of that hormone ADH, and thus our urinary output is more dilute and is higher. Right? Our urinary output increases and is more dilute. On the flip side, if you're not drinking much water, your urinary output decreases and becomes more concentrated as your body secretes a lot of ADH to add tons of aquaporins to reabsorb as much water as possible. So the role of the kidneys is to maintain many homeostatic balances in the body, and it does so by filtering your blood very effectively. Each drop of blood in your body passes through the kidney about 350 times per day, and the kidney failure is the breakdown of will lead to the breakdown of homeostasis and death, and this occurs shortly thereafter. You can't survive without your kidneys for very long. We will explore ways that you can prolong your life a little bit later in the unit. I'm sure a lot of you know it, which is kidney dialysis. Now, human kidneys filter out about half a cup of fluid from the blood each minute. And without reabsorption of water, you would urinate about 45 gallons of water a day. So reabsorption of water into the blood occurs mainly through osmosis when the filtrate fluid has been filtered and travels through the tubule and into the collecting duct. Now, reabsorption here is controlled by a negative feedback mechanism, which is ADH, and ADH increases the permeability of your collecting ducts via aquaporins. ADH is regulated by receptor cells in the hypothalamus. You see that making a return over and over again because it makes a ton of hormones for the body. And if a person does not have sufficient water, obviously we're going to produce a ton of ADH. And if a person is drinking a lot of water, we're going to produce less ADH. Now, next class we are going to be talking about the bladder, and we're going to be exploring some of the ways in which we can keep those people alive if their kidneys are failing. Have a wonderful day, everyone.